Hey there, tax nerds. Guess what? It's summer!
And like many of you, we are going to be taking some well-deserved time off this summer.
But never fear, we're going to be airing some of our favorite episodes from over the past year.
And we'll be back with new episodes in August. In the meantime, give this one another listen. I'm Bridget Stomberg.
And I'm Lisa D. Simone.
And this is Taxes for the Masses.
Today's episode is on so-called sin taxes.
One of the roles of tax policy is to shape taxpayers' behavior. In this episode, we discuss the role of sin taxes in discouraging legal but potentially harmful behavior and in raising tax revenue.
Hello, B.
Hello, Lisa.
Today we're talking about sin taxes. And so I think it's important to start by defining what we mean because it's a bit of an odd term.
I will grant you that, so please go ahead and define a sin tax.
Okay, a sin tax, according to the interwebs, can also be called a vice tax or a sumptuary tax.
I'm sorry, sumptuary? I don't know that I don't remember that word from the list of SAT vocab words, so please go ahead and define sumptuary for me.
Okay, hold your horses. As I was saying, a sin tax, according to the interwebs, can also be called a vice tax or a sumptuary tax. And it's generally an excise tax levied on certain goods, services, or activities that are considered to be harmful to society and individuals, but nonetheless are legal.
Okay.
Back to your question, the word sumptuary means, quote, designed to regulate extravagant expenditures or habits on moral or religious grounds.
Okay, so it's an old-timey word.
It seems that way, yes.
All right. So that tracks. Thank you. But then you just said a different phrase that now we need to define because this is how taxes go.
Yeah.
You said that a sin tax or a sumptuary tax is a, quote, excise tax. So what the heck is an excise tax?
Yeah. Okay. Fair question. Excise tax is one that's imposed on goods, services, and activities rather than on, say, like income or transactions per se.
Yep. So
they're considered indirect taxes, and the tax base is sometimes a quantity as opposed to a dollar amount.
Okay, great. So now I'm just going to ask you, what is an indirect tax?
Oh my God, did you swallow a question bug today?
I think I've been living in a house with a 10-year-old a little bit too long, and I'm just in the mode of stonewalling progress with an endless barrage of questions.
One of the many reasons I'm childless. Alrighty. A direct tax is one that a taxpayer pays directly to the government. So classic example, personal income tax.
Yes.
You can't shift the economic burden of your income tax onto somebody else. You earn the income. Yeah, people have tried.
Try as you may.
People have tried, but you can't. In contrast, an indirect tax can be levied on one party, say a manufacturer, but passed on to another party, say a customer, through the manufacturer just increasing its price to the customer to account for and recoup that tax.
Fantastic. Okay, so final question, I think. Is this going to turn into an R-rated episode?
I think we should keep it PG-13 at most.
I like that.
So it sounds salacious, right? But sin taxes don't necessarily address illegal behavior, right? Back to my original definition, a lot of it is actually perfectly legal behavior. It's just potentially harmful. And in particular, it's potentially harmful to the person who's doing it.
Yes.
Okay, so we're not going to get into the really, really bad stuff. We're going to keep it PG-13 here. But the thing to keep in mind is it's not necessarily illegal. It's just maybe bad for you.
Well, thank goodness that we're going to keep it PG-13 because I would not want to alienate our middle school listeners.
That's true.
So last thing we want to do.
A fair point.
Okay. So how about we give some examples of sin taxes and discuss their pros and their cons. And I think that will segue nicely into digging into some of those perverse consequences that they can have. Does that sound like a plan?
That sounds perfect.
Okay.
We've already defined a sin tax generally and noted that sin taxes don't regulate illegal activity.
No, ma'am.
Right? That's what fines and like jail time are for.
So can you give us some examples of sin taxes that we might encounter here in the U.S.?
Sure. Yeah. Classic examples are excise taxes on alcohol, tobacco, drugs.
Yeah.
Some more recent examples, we've been taxing sugar, like soft drinks.
Yep.
The use of single-use plastic bags, gambling, and even tanning beds, which I did not know was a thing, but yeah. And sin taxes are not unique to the United States. In 2018, Norway increased the levy on chocolate and confections by 83% to the rough equivalent of about 10 cents an ounce.
That's not cool.
I don't really care about chocolate.
I know you don't, but come on. Do not be taxing chocolate. That's not cool. So I love taxes generally.
Yes, I do.
Not a huge fan of paying them.
Of course not, because you're also very cheap.
Very, very cheap. And there's a story about
I'm sorry. Extremely careful with money.
You can say cheap. And if we were going to the R-rated version of the show, I would tell the story about Norway that revealed just how cheap I actually am.
Listeners, oh boy, you're just going to have to picture it in your head.
Okay, so yes, love taxes, but I'm cheap. And I'm also not a huge fan of taxes being levied on my vice, which I guess is chocolate and confections. Okay, so if you're going to tax my chocolate, I would really like to know that there's a solid reason for these sin taxes existing in the first place, but not just in theory. I want some solid academic research in support of their effectiveness.
Okay, you're asking for a lot here because showing definitively that any tax directly impacts any behavior or outcome is inherently challenging.
Excuses.
Good thing for you. I'm up for a challenge. All right, so proponents of sin taxes argue that they reduce the extent to which individuals engage in that targeted harmful behavior by making that behavior more expensive, right? Makes sense. You increase the cost of it. Some people are going to fall out and say that's too costly. I'm not going to do it anymore. A sin tax on sugar intends to curb excessive sugar consumption, which has been linked to obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, depression. The list goes on.
All right. So basically this is like a Sophie's Choice situation for someone like me, because you're pitting my frugality against my love of sugary foods. All right. So I want some evidence. So when Norway abruptly and quite unfairly increased the tax on candy and soda by 80% and 40% respectively, what happened?
Side note, now that we're talking about Norway, are you willing to tell the Norway story?
No.
It's almost like we're there.
It is.
We're talking about.
But we're not.
Okay. All right, your question. What happened in Norway? Well, the authors of a 2020 published academic article concluded, quote, "We were not able to detect reductions in sales that coincided with an increase in taxes." End quote.
Sorry.
The authors speculated that the tax increases, although large in terms of percentage change, were, quote, "too modest to affect the prices to alter sales sufficiently." So in this case, there's, I'd say, pretty limited evidence that a sin tax on sugar and chocolate, quote unquote, worked.
And I think that's a fair conclusion. It's bringing up a good point, because when we did lots of math and conversions, it turned out that this huge percentage increase was only about 10 cents per ounce of chocolate. And I know for a fact that wouldn't slow me down.
Right. You're fairly price insensitive when it comes to chocolate.
When it comes to chocolate, I mean, that's not even a speed bump, let alone a stop sign, as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so maybe sugar and maybe chocolate, maybe Norway, not the best. Let's go to tobacco excise taxes, because those are much larger.
Yeah.
Like ridiculously large.
Yeah.
In the US, the federal excise tax on a pack of cigarettes is around $1 per pack. That is $10 a carton for those of you keeping track. So that's a lot more. Have those sin taxes been effective in reducing smoking?
Yeah, I mean, generally, yes. The headline result is that a price increase of 10% on a pack of cigarettes is associated with a 4% reduction in demand for cigarettes for the general population of adults, and a 7% reduction in demand for children, which seems great because we shouldn't be giving cigarettes to children.
No.
There's also evidence of similarly beneficial effects of alcohol and gasoline taxes. However, there is a lack of evidence that heavy or long-term smokers are impacted by these changes in cigarette prices.
All right, so I would say that's fairly consistent evidence of sin taxes having their intended effect on individual behavior when it's big enough, when the tax is big enough for people to really pay attention to it.
And for people who haven't been doing it their entire lives.
Exactly, and have that physical addiction that they can't overcome. So, of course, a tax would have to be prohibitively high to completely stop a behavior, right?
Right.
And at that point, if the government really wanted to completely stop the behavior, they could just go ahead and make it illegal.
And create a black market for the good, yes.
Yes, and then forego the tax revenue. But,
Right.
we're starting to get into the dark side of sin taxes. But the studies you're referencing suggest that these taxes might be working as intended, generally speaking.
Yeah.
We get to keep the activity legal. We're not creating a black market. So what's not to like?
A few things. I think there are a few things not to like. So for starters, critics of sin taxes argue that they're regressive, meaning they're a larger share of the income that lower income individuals have to pay in order to purchase things. And that's just true, right? That's just fact.
If a person who makes $50,000 a year has a 2-pack a day cigarette habit, they're going to spend roughly 1.5% of their total income on federal excise taxes. If that same smoker was making $500,000 a year, federal excise taxes would make up only 0.15% of their income.
And I appreciate that you were careful to emphasize federal excise taxes in your example, because that made me think about state excise taxes as well. And those can vary dramatically, which can also cause issues.
Yep.
So sticking with cigarettes, state excise taxes range from a low of 17 cents per pack in Missouri to $5.30 per pack in New York.
You heard that right, folks. $5.30 a pack in New York.
Holy moly.
Holy moly indeed. For criminals who are willing to do a little bit of driving, this is the black market that you were referencing a second ago, there are really some fantastic arbitrage opportunities.
I bet there are.
So for example, you can drive about 340 miles from Virginia to New York, buy cigarettes in Virginia where the excise tax is only 60 cents a pack, smuggle them into New York City, and then sell them for less than they would cost in stores and still make a hefty profit.
Enough to cover your gas, I'm sure.
And then some.
Okay, so opportunities for criminal behavior is another potential negative consequence of sin taxes.
So when taxes are high, illegal markets are likely to exist. Question.
Okay.
Genius idea.
Okay.
Do we need a sin tax on crime?
I think you're missing the point here.
A sin tax on being obstinate?
Would that stop you?
Probably not.
Okay.
All right, we've defined sin taxes, given some examples, and discussed some academic evidence that suggests they actually can be effective in achieving their goals of reducing undesirable behavior as long as they're big enough and administered under the right circumstances. But they're also considered regressive, which we generally don't like. And they can have some unintended consequences like incentivizing criminal behavior and creating illegal markets. So we're going to keep that theme going with some more discussion of the negative consequences of sin taxes.
Okay, yeah. So let's go back to local excise taxes for a moment. If a sin tax is imposed at the federal level, it's very costly to avoid for most of the U.S.
Yep.
But if a sin tax is imposed by a local government, it might be much easier to avoid. We see similar behavior with sales taxes, right? Individuals who live in a state with a sales tax will often drive to an adjacent state with no sales tax in order to make those really large purchases. Even though technically they should pay a use tax in their home state, but we know that compliance with use taxes is low.
We
Like
could just
really,
say
really
non-existent.
low. Non-existent.
Non-existent. So that same, we'll just call it evasion that you see with sales taxes, same thing goes for sin taxes. So for example, in 2017, the city of Philadelphia implemented a 1.5 cents per ounce tax on sweetened beverages like soda. Researchers from Drexel University surveyed consumers to ask them how much their soda consumption changed after the tax was imposed. 39% of Philadelphians reported drinking fewer sugar-sweetened beverages, which seems great.
Yeah.
But the decline was only about 3 fewer sugary beverages a month.
Okay.
So as a result, the authors characterized the effect of the tax as low and noted that the availability of untaxed sugary beverages outside of the city limits was one potential cause.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another study from researchers at the University of Georgia and Indiana University on the Philadelphia soda tax documented another problem with sin taxes: substitution.
Go on.
The study found an increase in purchases of sugary foods in Philadelphia stores around the imposition of the soda tax. They concluded, as others have, that individuals tend to substitute their consumption of the heavily taxed vice with another untaxed or more lightly taxed vice.
So this is people being rational, right?
Yeah.
And what this means is when you're looking at the academic evidence on the efficacy of these taxes, you got to be wary. Because even if we see a reduction in the consumption of the sugary beverage or whatever the intended behavior was, there might not be an actual reduction in the vice, which is the underlying culprit that we're trying to target.
Yeah, and that distinction between what gets taxed and how much can have even broader effects. One of the examples Scott Hodge discusses in his book Taxocracy relates to excise taxes on alcoholic beverages. And it turns out these taxes are not all created equally, and differences could really affect prices.
I found this really interesting. So federal excise taxes on standard alcoholic beverages are going to vary. So for example, a can of beer will cost you about 5 cents in an excise tax, whereas a 5-ounce glass of wine will cost you only 4 cents. Not a huge difference.
No.
But if we're talking about 1.5 ounces of distilled spirits, the federal excise tax comes in at almost 13 cents.
That is a big difference.
Yes.
And it has real effects in the economy. So as a result of these differences in taxation of different types of drinks, White Claw, which markets itself as a hard seltzer, is subject to lower excise taxes than High Noon's vodka seltzer. And that's because...
How is that possible?
Yeah, that's because White Claw is made through fermentation like beer. Because it's created like beer, it's taxed like a beer.
Got it.
As Josh Barrow points out in his article, How Tax Policy Gave Us White Claw, a 6-pack of White Claw would be subject to almost $2 more in excise taxes in New York City if it were made by mixing vodka, which is a distilled spirit, with seltzer, like the High Noon vodka seltzer. Now, it's still going to taste like White Claw, and maybe that's not a good thing.
I've never had this, but I find this truly fascinating.
Yeah.
Because when you're thinking about the college kids, they're just looking for the cheapest way.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
So excise taxes for the win. And now we're going to go all the way back to the top of the episode.
I love it.
These excise taxes, like you informed us, are indirect, which means they are assessed to the manufacturer, but they can potentially be passed on to the customer if the customer is willing to pay a higher price. So tell me, are consumers willing to pay more for High Noon, which is a distilled spirit?
It's complicated.
You and your complications.
I know. I'm very difficult. A 12-pack of White Claw at Target costs $15.99, whereas only 8 cans of High Noon costs $17.99.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean High Noon and other distilled spirit retailers have succeeded in passing all of the higher excise tax on to customers, right? Some of it might be borne by the manufacturer.
Absolutely. So even though the price is higher, we don't know how much of that, if any, is attributable to the excise taxes.
Right.
As a matter of fact, Brooke Glover, who's the founder of a company called Swilled Dog Hard Cider and Spirits, these names are great.
Yep.
Explained to The Hill, quote, "Our margins are greater on the spirit side, but because of the taxes, we actually make less money." So if that person is speaking for the industry as an average, it would suggest that they are not able to successfully pass all of those excise taxes onto their customers in the form of higher prices. Glover takes it a step further and actually believes that their business would double overnight if the excise tax on spirits was lower.
Double overnight?
Double overnight.
And how many hard ciders did he have before he came up with that?
All right, on to the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I'll kick it off by saying this is another episode, wasn't an income tax episode, which I always like it when we mix it up. And we're talking about like a real practical thing that everybody can understand.
Yeah, I agree.
Also got to say sin multiple times. It's fun.
Talk about vices. Talk about morality and religion indirectly.
Sumptuary.
Okay, on to the bad.
On to the bad. So one thing that we could say about sin taxes being bad, this is something we haven't yet talked about, is that even though they're intended to target like an unhealthy level of a behavior, right? Like if you have a glass of wine a night or a week, that's not potentially going to harm your health, but you still have to pay the excise tax, right? You still have to pay the sin tax. So one criticism of sin taxes is that they affect everyone who uses the good, even if they're not doing it in an abusive or an unhealthy way. Now, obviously, the tax is going to impact people more the more they use the good, which is sort of the point. But you could make the argument that they're not very targeted.
All I heard was that a glass of wine a night is fine according to B. So
100%.
I'm taking that and running with it. No, that's a great point. I also think it begs the bigger question of like, and I'm sorry, because we're tax people. We like taxes, right?
We do.
Is a tax really the right approach here? There are other options, right? We could change marketing around these types of products. Does it all have to be a federal policy related to extracting additional resources from the users of these products?
And I think that's a particularly important question because we've talked about the regressivity of these taxes. And so the more you increase them, the more you're shifting the burden to the lower income individuals. And you raise a really good point when it comes to cigarettes. We have tried other things as well. We've got the warning label on the side of the package. There's been regulations around how much advertising can be directed at children and things of that nature. But I just go back to the scene in Kill Bill 2. Unclear. Let's call it Kill Bill 2.
Okay.
Where Michael Madsen's character is working at the strip club and he doesn't show up for work or does something, and his boss cancels all of his days and says the only thing that you kids respond to is me effing with your cash. So maybe it does all need to be tied to money.
It is a big motivator. It just seems really hard to design a sin tax properly.
Yep.
And it raises some almost like existential questions about what behavior are we really trying to target here, right? Like, what is the difference between White Claw and High Noon when it comes to trying to reduce alcohol consumption?
Yeah, it's an excellent point, and it's based on such like a technical detail. And if you actually dig into the reality here, White Claw is 5 to 8% alcohol by volume, whereas High Noon is only 4.5%, so it's less alcohol by volume, but it has a higher alcohol excise tax because of the way it's created. Like that just is reinforcing your point about how difficult it is to design these things. Okay, ugly. Here's one that I'm hoping you can explain to me, because every year that I taught this to my undergrads, I would get this question and I wouldn't really know what to say to them.
Okay.
The point of the tax is to stop a behavior.
Yes.
But then we often impose these taxes and then earmark the revenue for some spending initiative. And if the tax actually stopped the behavior, then we wouldn't have the revenue to spend. So are we trying to stop behavior? Are we trying to raise because we can't do both.
Yes.
We can't eat our cake and have it too.
We're trying to eat our cake and have it too.
Yes. So, okay.
Well, welcome to government policy.
101. Love it. All right. So I'm not just a dum-dum here who doesn't get it.
I guess technically you can have both, in the sense that it's going to stop fewer people than you want and raise less revenue than you want, right? You're going to fall short on both goals.
On both. Yeah, absolutely. And that's all fun and games until the people getting hurt are kindergarten children.
I'm sorry, what?
Yes. So this Philadelphia tax that we were talking about, the soda tax, it was earmarked for kindergarten programs, which if anybody's watched Abbott Elementary, we know that public kindergartens, public schools in Philly could use some money.
Yeah.
But because the revenue from the tax was, a shortfall, and not even because people were consuming less sugar, but because they were either substituting it for their tasty cakes or going outside of the city limits.
Yep.
The little kindergartners didn't get the tax revenue that they were promised. So not only is it not a win-win, it actually kind of turns into a lose-lose.
That's the worst kind of outcome.
100%. Hurting question.
Yeah.
So we've decided that 10 cents an ounce is not enough of an excise tax on chocolate to make me stop.
Right.
Is there a high enough excise tax on cheese to make you curtail your behavior?
Haven't seen it yet.
Okay.
Well, that's all we have time for today.
Be sure to join us for more tax nerdery on future episodes of Taxes for the Masses.